It's Tuesday, May 22nd, 2018, and it's time for Vanran10 on sports. Sports. So, as you can see in the title, we're going to talk about has NASCAR lost its soul? Now, this comes from a little bit of a controversy going into the Coca-Cola 600. Which has to do with the fact that pretty much all season, NASCAR has been running under the 40 car limit. Back when I watched, you could have 43 cars in a race. Now they've lowered it to 40. So with the NY Racing team joining the fray for this race, there will be 41 cars trying to make the race. Now, NY Racing is owned by Mr. Cohen, I think his name is. John Cohen. Yeah, John Cohen. JJ Yaley is going to drive the car. He's an okay driver. He's not the greatest in the universe, but he's solid. He's definitely been in, the upper tiers of NASCAR, and he did it for quite a few years. So NY Racing Team, they've also got Steakhouse Elite as their sponsor, signed a multi-race deal with them. Now, this kind of caused a little bit of ire from a guy named Rob Kaufman. I guess he kind of, lost his mind a little bit and started tweeting out stupid things like small teams like Mr. Cohen's devalue racing, devalue NASCAR. Because he's not a charter member, 40 cars that have been racing for most of the season or trying to race for most of the season. See, here's the thing. 40 cars haven't been in a lot of these races. I think the Daytona 500 barely made the 40 mark. And that's their biggest race with their biggest payout. And I think only 40 cars showed up for that. So nobody went home in that race. Now, the Coca-Cola 600 is going to get a 41st car. By my estimation, NY Racing is in their first race. What chance do they really have of making it? But Mr. Kaufman decided to complain and say, now that there's a 41st car, that means somebody's going to go home with no money. Well, it used to happen all the time. When there was 43 cars, there'd be 45 cars trying to make the field, and 2 cars would go home with no money. In fact, for a little bit of a time, there were the starting parks, and they were awful. There was basically teams that would come into NASCAR, and they would race, they would qualify for the race, they would race for a few laps, and then they would claim that there was, brake problems or radiator problems or, electrical problems or something like that, and they would park the car after a few laps, and they would take their paycheck. They don't spend a lot of money, but they would make a little bit of money. And, a lot of people got pissed off at this. I didn't like this very much either. It's like, don't show up just to qualify and then drive around for a few laps. I'm sure the drivers hated that, the drivers of those cars. But, I'm sure it was a paycheck and they probably hung their hat on qualifying for those races. Because, back in the 90s, and early 2000s, just qualifying for a race was a big deal. So, Rob Kaufman is kind of complaining about the fact that bringing in another small team that's not going to race a full schedule is going to devalue NASCAR. Now, I don't know why he said that. There are small teams all throughout NASCAR, but the 36 charter members, and whatever, a charter, I guess, is you basically buy your way into guaranteeing that you will be in every race. If you are a charter member, you basically have bought your way into every race in the season that you show up to. So no matter what, you're in. So if 50 cars show up and you've got a charter membership, then you're guaranteed in the race, and the other 14 jackals have got to fight for the last 4 spots in a 40-car field. But you're guaranteed in. Whether you have good qualifying or practices or not, you're guaranteed to make the race. So why is this guy complaining when he's a charter member This doesn't affect him. Not even a little bit. This affects him not at all. So I'm not sure why he's complaining about it. It doesn't affect him. His team is still going to make the race. He's part owner of Chip Ganassi Racing, which has Kyle Larson and Jamie McMurray. Both of those guys are going to be in the race. I promise both of them will be in the Coca-Cola 600. So I'm not sure why Kaufman was complaining about this problem. So there was a lot of tweeting about it and a lot of, that somebody is now going to have to go home. This is not a big deal. This has happened many, many, many times in NASCAR, so I'm not sure why Kaufman is complaining. It doesn't affect him because his cars are going to make the race no matter what. But he says these smaller teams devalue NASCAR. NASCAR was founded on small teams. Remember, way back in the day, think back, look at the history lessons. These gigantic teams with 3 and 4 cars didn't exist in the 50s. And if they did, I'm not aware of them, but it wasn't until, Hendrick and Junior Johnson and some of these others. If you remember, Dale Earnhardt, Richard Childress Racing was a 1-car team. It was just Earnhardt until he brought in the 31 car and put in Mike Skinner alongside of him. So for a long time, there was only 1 car in Richard Childress Racing. At his biggest point, I think Richard Childress Racing had 3 cars in his stable. He may have had a year of 4. But I think he's maintained 3 for a while, and I think he's down to 2. I don't think he's doing 3 anymore. I know he has Austin Dillon as one of his drivers, and I think maybe even Ryan Newman is still there. But, Hendrick didn't have, when a lot of these, they started out, they only had 1, maybe 2 cars. You didn't come in with a 4-car team. You built up your 1 team for the most part, and you had tons of different owners. I remember Jimmy Means used to race on just whatever prize money he could scrape together, and he would he only had a few people helping him, and he had a lot of volunteers. And I remember just seeing that number 52 Jimmy Means car wouldn't really ever have sponsorship. He would hustle to try to get somebody to just sponsor him and give him a few bucks for a race. I remember Eureka Vacuums used to be on his cars, on the hood. He would have this light blue car with a black hood that said Eureka. So NASCAR was founded on small teams. It was built on small teams. So has NASCAR lost its soul? The money that's involved in this now is way too much. It costs over $20 million to run a race team for a season. That's too much. I have another video where I talked about this, that NASCAR is too expensive and they need to cut costs somehow. They need to make it so that these cars aren't so specialized. And every race doesn't have to have its own car. But we're at that point where it's like there's so many... It's like you don't even really have mechanics anymore. You have engineers. There's no real mechanics. Your pit crew... It used to be your pit crew was just guys that were part of the race team. And, part of the guys that would fix the car, they would go over the wall and pit the cars as well. Now, pit crews are athletes that, I remember when somebody could do a pit stop in sub 20 seconds, that was a big deal. It's like, I got him out in 19.5. That was a huge deal. Changed 4 tires, put in 2 cans of gas, and it was done in under 20 seconds. And that was a big deal back in the 80s. It was like, whoa, how'd they do that? Now, a 20-second pit stop means you probably go 6 laps down. I don't know. But it's terrible. It's like, but we've specialized everything so much in NASCAR. And when the money was good, when NASCAR was booming and the money was all there, it was fine. But the money's not there right now. The money kind of went away. I think, and it happened when the recession happened. When the recession happened, a lot of these people that threw their money into NASCAR really started to take a look at where their advertising dollars were going. And they knew they had to still advertise, but now they had to pare back their advertising. They had to go, is it really worth it to have a driving billboard going around in a circle at one racetrack, and we're not even going to get seen very often. This was also another thing I talked about. To get the sponsors back, you have to show them more love. If they're only on TV for 2 or 3 minutes, that's not enough for a sponsor anymore. You got to give them bang for their buck. So, and I may talk about that topic at another time more in depth, but NASCAR needs the small teams to have some kind of a chance to at least race. Not necessarily win. I mean, Alan Kulwicki is the last independent to win a championship. And I don't think a one-car team is ever going to win. If you look, Martin Truex Jr. last year, he won his championship when he was a 2-car team with Eric Jones. And so it's the weirdest thing. He was a 1-car team. When Furniture Row Racing first started, I think they had 2 cars. They had 1 car, then I think they went to 2 cars. Then they just stayed at 1 car for a long time. Then they brought in Eric Jones in the 77. And all of a sudden, Truex wins a title. Then they get rid of, Eric Jones goes over to Joe Gibbs Racing and they get rid of the 2nd car. So, and he's struggling a little bit. He's still doing pretty good, but right now Harvick's doing everything. But NASCAR used to build its sport on the independents. It was just guys who loved to race. And now it's too corporate. Now it's too big. And it's kind of imploded on itself because the money's not there anymore to run the sport the way it was being run in the early 2000s. Now we're starting to see the regression of the sport. There's a lot of things people can't afford to race. And even the big teams are having hard times finding sponsorship to support the $20 million a year habit. The prize money isn't really there either. I think to win Daytona, gives you a little over $1 million. Don't quote me on that. But I think your big races like, even if you win the big 3, let's say you win the Brickyard, you win the Coca-Cola 600, and you win Daytona. I think that might net you about $2.2 to $2.5 million. It costs $20 million to run a race team. So you need those sponsors, but the sponsors aren't there. Advertisers and big companies don't think it's worth it to put their sponsorships on these vehicles. So you need the little race teams to supplement. We're not getting full 40-car fields. Why would you yell at a small team that wants to take their shot? It'll fill out the field. Yeah, the prize money might be a little bit less for everybody, but it's, you're sharing in the wealth, and maybe that little race team someday becomes a big race team. It's how most of these big race teams didn't start out gigantic. I know that it's kind of different with Stewart-Haas, because, that's Tony Stewart, and he understood he still had to have a 3-car team to really compete. And he could find the sponsorship because he's a 3-time champion. He could put it all together. He's a great salesman. I mean, it's the reason the guy was a champion and a great race driver, and he was a great PR guy as well. So he was able to put those teams together, win championships with his teams. He may win another one with Harvick this year. Let's face it, but that's tough to do. But back in the day when you started a race team, you had 1 car and you started it with 1 and you built yourself up until you could maybe get a 2nd car. And of course, really in the early days, you were just 1 car and that's all you thought of having. Then in the 80s, Hendrick brought in a few cars. Jimmy Johnson, I think, Junior Johnson went to a 2-car team. You need the little teams. NASCAR's a little bit lost its soul. It's too corporate. It needs to remember its roots, and I think it may pare all the cost back. You got to find a way to cut costs, pare it all back. Try to get away from being too much of a corporation, and remember, it's racing. It's supposed to be fun, and it's supposed to be done by people who are passionate about it. I believe they're there. So to the troops, past, present, and future, thanks for the freedom.